How is everybody? Besides the warmth, welcome and thank you for coming. We're so excited. I hope you're as excited as I am. Every time I come to Dinsmore, I love it here. I just have a couple of things that I wanted to, just kind of basic housekeeping things and a couple of announcements. We have, if I can find it, where's the sign?
Right behind you.
Oh, it's that way. We have a new sign for the museum. That will go in the window, and the reason we're putting a sign in the window is because the work that we have long been waiting for is almost done, right?
Right.
So there were some leaks and issues there, and they got to work on it at our urging. And several board members have been going over there and working themselves crazy every Tuesday. So we're going to, as soon as we can, get all of the display cases in place, back where they should be, get things cleaned up so we can open. So if anybody wants to volunteer, you can talk to me, you can talk to Steve, you can talk to Pat, you can talk to Brent, any of the board members. We'll have probably regular openings, not super frequent at first, but we would like to be able to open that again. So that's exciting. We also, let's see, what else did I want to say to you? Tell you something. Oh, the archive at the library. A lot of the archival records from the courthouse have already been transferred. These are the original records, not the books quite yet. The books that you would look in, if you've done research over there, are duplications or abstractions of the original records. The original records we've been taking one by one and cataloging and putting in archival storage materials, and they're going into secure shelving at the library that is locked. But you, as a public member, could, if you wanted to request to see an original document that pertains to some research that you're doing, you can call us and we can set up an opportunity for that. We're still in process, but each item is being cataloged. So we'll be able to put our hands on a specific one instead of digging through a whole bunch of stuff. So it's exciting. I think that's mostly it, except that we wanted to, as the Historical Society, present Dinsmore with a donation.
Oh, nice. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And appreciation for this historic jewel that we have that's really, really an amazing repository of history. And I wanted to give Cathy, for her time, a little present. It's one of our ornaments.
Oh,
yeah, so you can have that for later.
Thank you, guys.
There are minutes from last meeting and treasurer's reports up here if anybody would like them, and you all have all had the sign-in sheet, I think. So I'm going to get out of Cathy's way so she can do what she does.
Well, I'll kind of open up the house, the bottom floor, if anybody wants to go through any time during the meeting or after the meeting, probably. And you'll see lots of things that we can put that money toward. So Dinsmore Homestead, in existence since 1842, and actually built by John Brady. In 1842, started in 1842, finished after the family moved in. So when they moved in, they were still putting in windows and doors. But stayed in the family until 1987, when it was turned over to a private foundation who's still running it today. Mostly Boone County citizens, though we do try to reach a little further afield to bring in more money. So what I thought I'd do is say a little bit about the foundation, then a little bit about the house, and a little bit about the family, using some of the quotes of the family. So, the mission of the Dinsmore Homestead is preservation, obviously, education, research, and contributing to the cultural heritage of the region. So we aren't just Boone County, we like to push ourselves a little outward to Cincinnati and even to the United States. I think we should be a landmark, but not everyone agrees. So, all original outbuildings, and everything inside the house is original, and we have 90,000 pages of original primary sources from the family. So we have an awful lot to tell our story from. So we have a wine house, 2 tenant houses, an ice house, a cabin that predated the family and was used by the family as a cabin for enslaved people, a graveyard, and of course the main house and lots of farm buildings. So we can tell a story that not a lot of places can. Not every building dates to 1842, but every building dates to the time when the family owned it. So I think the most recent building was a tenant house across the road in the 1930s. But there was always a tenant house there, so it's in the right place. As far as the house goes, everything in the house is original except the curtains and the silver on the table, because you aren't supposed to watch the silver. But everything else, the family just got up and left. So we have over 2,000 books that deal with farming, religion, spiritualism, history, all sorts of topics. Fun books. We have an 1859 Steinway piano they ordered from Cincinnati, paid $450 for it. That's about $16,000 in today's money. We have a 144-piece set that is now probably 60 pieces of the china that Julia Dinsmore ordered in the early 1880s, imported from Great Britain. So the letters, the receipts, the journals they kept, all of that feeds into what's in the house, how much it cost them, when they got it, and what they were doing with all the buildings on the outside. We did apply for and were accepted into the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom because of 2 runaways on the property. Sally Taylor lived in that cabin with her 7 children. One of them, Isaac Sanders, ran away. He was caught in Petersburg, or right across from Petersburg. So we have the notation where James pays, I think it was Marcellus McNeely, to return Isaac. So that kind of thing adds a lot to the fact that, hey, they weren't happy here. They probably weren't good slave owners. Also, Nancy Magruder ran away, and I'll talk a little bit about her later. Let's see. Also, we're getting panels, thanks to the library and the National Park Service. We're going to have panels up about slavery, what it would have been like, and all the people who were on the property. Let's see, tenants. They also had tenants working on the farm, and some of those families are still around. The Loudons, the Coons family, the Bradys across the road, and Rudisills. So there are some of those families that we do still trace. Some of the German immigrants who worked for the family, the Decks, the Mauers, the Klopps. Their families had children and stayed in the county for generations. So we do try to trace those people and their stories. Let's see. So as far as the story of the family goes, and that's kind of what we do focus on the most, although we do try to add in the workers and the enslaved people and servants. But James Dinsmore was not a Kentuckian by birth, and he didn't come here the usual way. Normally people moved west from Virginia or North Carolina. He was actually born a Yankee up in New Hampshire. Graduated from Dartmouth in 1813, and his father, as he was dying of tuberculosis, told his family, "Get out of New Hampshire, the air is bad." So that is oral history. We don't have that facts on that, but everybody left, so it's possibly true. James decided to go to the Deep South, which seems odd since he did write that he disliked slavery. Ends up in Natchez, Mississippi, gets in good with a very wealthy family there, and purchased a plantation as a partner in Louisiana, where he has 60 enslaved people working for him. He goes up the year after he buys the plantation to New Jersey to marry Martha McComb. Martha came from a very well-connected family. Her brother was commanding general of the U.S. Army when they were married, and for about the next 10 years. Her father had owned the house in New York City where George Washington stayed when New York City was the capital. So they married into the Livingstons, the von Feisters, and all sorts of people. And so James was definitely marrying up. He took her down to Louisiana. They eventually had 3 daughters, Isabella, Julia, and Susan. And almost as soon as James got down to Louisiana, he did not like it. And I'm not sure he ever thought he'd live on the plantation. I think he thought he'd live up here where his Uncle Silas was and write letters down to the overseer. That didn't work out. No one wanted to be overseer for very long. So he ended up living down there, but he told his Uncle Silas, who was living on the river here and owned what we now call Lockery Island. We might have called it that then, but he changed the name to Grape Island while he was there. And grape signifies what he was doing with the island. He would send James barrels of wine that he made himself. James read books on vineyards and tried growing grapes in Louisiana and was not successful. So he told his uncle to look out for land up here. In 1838, his uncle wrote him that there were 300 acres of Arcadian land fit for a shepherd. So he did buy the land right away, but it took him 4 years to sell the plantation. So it wasn't until 1842 when he moved up here. Let's see, living here, he had a much more diversified farm. In Louisiana, it was sugarcane and cotton. If one of them goes bad, you're pretty much doomed that year. Up here, he had the vineyard. Now, the wine was just for himself, but he did sell the grape cuttings. He made about 200 gallons of wine a year. He had 150 goats and sheep. He called them Angora goats and cashmere sheep, so really fine wool. He had 50 hogs. He had mules, oxen, and horses. He had an orchard up on the hill, and according to the census, there were over 1,000 apple trees, 100 peach trees. But in his fruit journal, he also wrote about persimmon, quince, cherry, pear, and plum. So all sorts of fruit. Made his own, well, he didn't. The workers made their own vinegar, they made cider, and most of it went to Cincinnati. What didn't go to Cincinnati went in barrels under the cabin. Let's see. Cross the road. He did not raise tobacco. By the time his daughter took over, that's all the tenants wanted to raise. But he did not have his tenants raising tobacco. He started raising osier willows, brought over immigrant Germans from over the Rhine, 20 to 40. And they made baskets, but they also helped dry the willows. They built a basket shop. They sold the willows and the baskets in Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and that was the most lucrative thing on the farm. So 1 year of peaches brought him $103. 1 year of baskets and osiers could get him $1,500 to $2,000. Wow. And that's splitting it among the tenants. So that was something that carried him through the Civil War. At one point he owned 900 acres. Right before the Civil War, he sold a lot off, ended up with 400, and that's what came down to 1987. So as far as the family goes, the youngest daughter, Susan, died in 1851 at 15 in a drowning accident. The oldest daughter, Isabella, married in 1859, right before the Civil War, moved up to Minnesota with her husband, and Mrs. Dinsmore died 10 days after Isabella was married. So during the Civil War, it was mostly James and Julia here. However, Isabella did come back when she found she was pregnant. She gave birth in 1861 to Patty, 5 years later, Sally. Both of them in an upstairs room in the house. So that's kind of why we call it a homestead. People came back to be buried, they came back to have children. So Julia took over the farm when James died in 1872. She was about 39 years old, had a really good education. She went to school in Cincinnati, learned things that most girls were not learning. She learned algebra, geometry, rhetoric, how to argue and debate, chemistry, phrenology, but had no use for it running the farm, and that really seemed to make it hard for her to adjust. All her tenants were male tenants. She didn't trust them a lick, and most of them had never been to school. So they could not write their names. They didn't trust what she was writing down, and she would have to call in her male neighbors to arbitrate between them. So 3 years after taking over the farm, she wrote in her journal, "I drudge and worry to no avail, lose money and temper and hope. I feel so unlike a lady in my externals that I have no doubt I shall soon be less a lady in reality, never having one day of leisure or pleasure in which I can be my own old self again." Over the years, she did adjust, got used to it, and no longer needed her neighbors as much. Let's see. She did take care of some of the African Americans who were elderly. After the Civil War, Sally Taylor and her children went over to Rising Sun. Another man, Gilson Hawkins, and his wife went to Rising Sun. Nancy was the only one who remained here. So Nancy has an interesting story. And this was a watercolor done by James's great-granddaughter. Nancy was brought up from Louisiana away from her husband because he was owned by someone else. She got up here, joined the Middle Creek Baptist Church, met Noah, who was enslaved by the Rice family, married him, and then he died about 3 years later. So she's about 55 when the Civil War ends. And unlike in most states, Kentucky slaves are not freed by the end of the war. So they had to wait until December of 1865 when 2/3 or 3/4 of the other states passed the 13th Amendment. Nancy wasn't going to wait. And she wasn't alone. Several African Americans from the local churches decided to leave in August and September. Nancy was kicked out of the church for, quote, leaving the state in a disorderly manner. She went up to Oxford, Ohio, which was on the Underground Railroad, and there were other Boone County African Americans up there. I'm assuming she knew somebody. Stayed up there until she hit 70, and no one would hire her. Men wouldn't even pay her for the work she'd already done. So she did come back here, lived in a cabin on the other side of the Roseberry house. It burned up in 1886 with all her belongings in it. And Julia moved her into this cabin, which is where she died at the age of 96. So she is buried up in the graveyard. So Julia did keep an eye on Nancy because she was constantly here. Lots of letters mention Nancy. They did call her Aunt Nancy. Aunt Nancy, she's writing to Patty, who writes very complaining, sad, despondent letters. Aunt Nancy hasn't seemed very well the last week or so, but Joe got her jug filled in Aurora yesterday, and I hope she will be revived. Poor thing, she has such a lonely life, always full of old age pains, and yet every day she thanks the Lord she is living. We all have things to be thankful for.
Wow.
Patty grew up here, went to school in Cincinnati. Her father lived up in St. Paul, Minnesota. And one of the unique things we have then is a father writing letters to his daughter about how to be a good woman. And he was very worried. Apparently she was getting what he called gewgaws from some of the local boys. He did not like that. So, referring to marriage as, quote, the question of the happiness or misery of your life, and akin to tying a millstone or a washtub about your neck for the balance of your life, he convinced her to wait until she was 21 to agree to marry. He thought that would help.
What year was that?
It was something like 1878, so she was about 17. So, a few days after her 21st birthday, she writes to Julia that she is now engaged. She became engaged to Tilden Selms, graduated from Yale, looked to be throwing money around everywhere, so this made her really happy. He had bought a ranch in the Dakota Territory, what is now North Dakota, and was boostering towns, buying up lots of land with his mother's inheritance, and expecting people would come out and buy it from him. Well, people started figuring out what North Dakota was like, and within a year of their marriage, he's in debt, and he spends the rest of his short life trying to pay people back, especially his mother. But two good things happen to Patty while she is out in North Dakota. First of all, she finds out she's pregnant. I say good because normally we think of that as a good thing. She did not. She just saw horror in front of her. So she wrote to Julia that she was, I never was much stuck on living, so the thought of my lights going out has no horrors for me. But she was worried about not being ill the rest of her life. So I guess she had seen people who had a bad childbirth and they just couldn't get around as easy as before. Julia's response was not meant to cheer her up. As far as dying is concerned, we have to take our chances in every way, every day, and yours are as good as anyone's. And I trust we are all better off when we do die. So,
You're a cheerful bunny.
that explains a lot of Patty's despondency. Also out in North Dakota, she met Teddy Roosevelt. And that began a years long, until he died. They kept up a correspondence. She did go to the White House twice. And when you open the front door of the house, the first thing you see is a portrait of Teddy signed over to Patty. After meeting Patty for the first time, he wrote to his sister that Patty was, quote, really to my mind a singularly attractive woman, very handsome, and, as one of his neighbors put it, I'm not very good at French, very séduisante, or seductive. Like most Kentucky girls. She is very well read, has a delicious sense of humor, and is extremely fond of poetry, including some of his favorites. So they did end up moving back to St. Paul so that her father could help them out. But every summer, Patty brought her daughter Isabella to Kentucky and stayed here for about 4 months. They rode horses, they went to Big Boone, did all sorts of things, went to Cincinnati quite a bit. And one time she wrote, which is kind of endearing, the first of next week I leave St. Paul and do not stop till I reach the dearest resting place on earth, your arms, writing to Julia. So she did love coming back here. When her husband was diagnosed at 40 years old with liver cancer, it seemed only natural that they would bring him here. So they set up a sick room in the house. He knew he was going to be buried up in the graveyard. Although he said if Patty got remarried, they should move him. But he died August 1st, 1895, when Patty was just 34 years old. Julia made a notation in the journal. He was buried in a patented burglar-proof coffin. So, even out in Boone County, there was a fear that somebody was going to walk up there with a shovel. So Patty started a ham business here. In 1896, 1 year after she started, she slaughtered over 70 hogs. The meat went to Cincinnati, went to Lexington, Louisville, St. Paul, and Chicago. And in 1901, the last year the business was running, they went to the White House because Teddy was there. So, and in 1902 then, with the business finished and Isabella getting close to 16 years old, they decided to move to New York City, where Patty's very wealthy sister was going to pay for Isabella's schooling at some of the best schools in the city, so that Isabella could have a very successful debutante season. Julia was quite worried about the debutante season and wrote to Isabella, quote, never dance, skate, or ride when you are unwell, no matter what the temptation may be. It is better to miss a little of the fun than to drag out life as an invalid with premature loss of good looks. I have had a reading acquaintance with New York society ever since I could read, and know that there are plenty of married and divorced men in it who take pleasure in spoiling a young girl's prospects, and I beg you to politely avoid them. So, they were hoping that the 19-year-old Isabella would marry someone close to her age, but she chose the 37-year-old Robert Ferguson, who was a Rough Rider. We do have his Rough Rider hat, a Stetson, with Teddy Roosevelt. So he's a friend of the Roosevelts, and that encouraged Isabella, I think. He also worked for John Jacob Astor, so he had some good connections there. He did develop tuberculosis after the first 2 children were born, and they eventually move out to New Mexico. So that's what takes the family far away. He dies. She marries his good friend John Greenway, another Rough Rider. He dies 3 years later, and they had moved to Arizona by that time. But they also had a house in Santa Barbara. When she built her house in Santa Barbara, it was so her children could go to school. There were no schools in New Mexico or Arizona where they lived. So Julia would go to New York City when they were in New York City. She started traveling all the way out to Santa Barbara when they all moved out there. So that's actually where she died at 93 years old in 1926. She was out there. They called this farm Boone, and she would go to New York City, she would go to Santa Barbara, but she always came back here in the spring for planting season. She wrote, Boone, meaning her farm, has been good enough for me, and if it is on the decline, so am I, and we will go down together. I have seen beauty of all kinds and style and other ways of life, but I am thankful for my home and elbow room in this crowded world. So she really enjoyed coming back here, putting on her calicos, not having to dress up, and getting outside. She died at 93, according to her wish. She wrote about them digging up Pocahontas, thought that was horrible, and said, don't forget to cremate me. So they cremated her, and her ashes are buried up in the graveyard. So, and if you have any questions.
My gosh. Wow.
So, let me think. Are any of the baskets here?
We do have baskets upstairs.
Yeah.
Yes. Big baskets is what they made.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned that the family just up and left. Do you know why?
Well, when Isabella died, so she became the first congresswoman from Arizona, went on to have a hotel built in Tucson, Arizona. So she had a house in Williams, Arizona, Tucson, Ajo, a house in New Mexico, a house in New York City, a house on Long Island, and a house in Kentucky. And this was the one that they cared about the least. Her kids looked to Isabella as kind of the start of a generation. They didn't look back as far as their great-great-grandparents. Yeah. So they were willing. Now, Isabella came in and took an inventory. So I think she was already thinking of turning it over to someone, but it was her daughter who finally did it. Now, they did have people writing and wanting to see the house to make it a golf course. And this would be the clubhouse. That fell through, luckily.
Oh, yeah, luckily. How would they even do that?
It'd be kind of marshy.
Yeah.
I've been on 20 miles.
Tell me about the Route 18 when it got put in and how that money was done with the county or the state.
I don't know. I just know that they all put in money. So they bought stock in the turnpike. And Julia was one of those. And they still had to pay the toll, which she was rather upset at. Because it did run through her property.
I first became aware of the Dinsmore place in the 1950s. And a friend that I had lunch with one day says, oh, Tom, you've got to see this. And I said, what are you talking about? And he says, it's a house down beyond Burlington, and it's down at the bottom of the hill, and they called us. He worked for Montgomery Heating, and they wanted heat put in the house. And
This is in the 50s?
we went there to do that. And nobody lived there. And the rug is rolled up in the front room where it came back from the cleaners probably in 1910 or whatever.
Like Miss Haversham's.
Yeah,
So I never did get down here in that time
Yeah.
frame, but he did, and was fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think there was a caretaker here.
Harry Roseberry, and it's really Harry that we thank for leaving everything. He would allow a cleaning woman to go in, she'd clean around everything. Everything stayed, not only everything stayed, but it stayed pretty much where it was. So the pictures are hanging where the family had them. 2 sofas have been switched, but most everything is where it was when they were living here. Yeah. Yes.
How much acreage was originally the Dinsmore Homestead, and how much is the Dinsmore Homestead now? How much acreage?
So James had 900 at the highest point. And they did use land as an investment. If you had money sitting around, it didn't go to the bank, because you couldn't trust that. You bought land. So then when you needed cash, you sold the land. So he sold it in 1860, about 500 acres. So it was something like 387. I'd say pretty much 400. And that's what came down to 1987. The Homestead Foundation, I believe, got 70, is what I've always heard. And then the rest was given to the State Nature Preserve, who sold it to Boone County Parks. Yeah. So.
And my understanding is the great at least the plants are still there, right? Some of them?
The vines
The
are
vines are
still
there.
there. Yeah, we aren't allowed to cut the trees.
Yeah.
So they'll never really
Right,
produce
they can't
anything,
cultivate
but
them
yeah.
back, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
If I may intrude into the party, I am John Walton, and you made reference in the very beginning that John Brady had built this house, or built the original house, and it was in 1844 that the Waltons bought from John Brady the Hilltop Farm where I now still reside, and that is, well, the original purchase, my great grandmother, was for 270 acres, and I'm ashamed to even say how much I recall having it said that it cost her. $1,700.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, my.
Anyhow,
Are you taking bids right now?
no, never mind, we won't go into that. One of the other interesting things in all of their travels, you know, it's very interesting that they travel so much.
Mhm.
But remember this part of it. This road was not built till 1877 as a toll road from Burlington to Bellevue, and as you just mentioned, it was taken by stock, and that, and of course my father, or my grandfather and great-grandfather were very much involved with that, because they owned that hill, and they owned the hill on the other side. There is another, you mentioned something about the thought that they should disperse of this property at one point, some of the members of the family. And Miss Julia was of course in charge at that time, and she was, I guess the word got out that they were willing to sell. She was willing to, the family wanted to sell it. Well, one of our great uncles made a bid, made an advancement toward purchase of that, and which would have added it to the Hilltop Farm up there. Then she turned that down, or it fell through, and then another great uncle tried to approach her in the same manner, and she turned that down. So thank goodness that she did. I don't. That was a good part of her. Of course, you talked about the livestock that they had. Martha, at one time, had 2 horses brought in from Arizona, and well, we stabled them up to on our hilltop till she could do something else with them down here, and she rode considerably. I'm trying to think now what other thing of interest I have. That is mainly, well, oh, I know, we referred to the house across, the tenant house across the road.
Seaburn Brady.
That was burned it burned in, and I'm not real sure when the original house burned. So
Yes.
this house is a newer
Right.
house over there.
It's kind of funny because, so they called it the Loudon House first.
Well, yes.
And that got destroyed, or is in such bad condition. Sally was Julia's other niece, not the Patty's sister, and her husband said that he was going to uplift the neighborhood by building a nice tenant house. So he built this house that Emma Rogers described as 4 bedrooms upstairs,
Wow.
a large downstairs, and it burned like 4 years later.
Oh, my.
So I don't think
Terrible.
Mr. Cutchin tried again to uplift the neighborhood.
And then it became the Brady house.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And the Brady who was in charge, or the overseer for her, was Sebring Brady.
Yeah.
And he lived there, well, he actually built or moved up on Upper Middle Creek in his later days after
Okay.
he left to that. I'm trying to think of any other interesting.
How far across the road was the property?
I would say with 900 acres, most of it was.
Did it,
So
did
this
it go
just
down
goes
as far
like,
as the river at one point?
at
though?
one point
I
supposedly.
think the 900 acres included land up Middle
Yeah,
Creek.
yeah,
They owned Rocky
Promise on down
Springs.
on
yeah,
the
on down.
river.
Yep.
And that, but it's what you said
Yeah.
about the property now
Right,
was what the original, what it
Yeah.
became,
right.
I guess I'd say, became in later years.
Yeah.
So Middle Creek Park was
Right.
Right.
part of Dinsmore.
Yes, part of Middle Creek Park was part of it it was not.
Oh, okay. So they got it from other people too.
Yeah, but, yeah.
Well, Julia did want to sell for a little bit there, and I think her brother-in-law was encouraging her. But there was something where she wrote, he wouldn't agree to pay the license fee. And so I said, forget it.
Right.
So I don't think she was really
Changed the
serious.
word, yeah.
And the graveyard was a big part of that. She didn't want to give up
Yeah.
the graveyard.
Yeah.
So.
I think you probably have published this statement, and I'll repeat, I'll let you fill in if I get it wrong. When Aunt Nancy was freed, as you said, she went up in Ohio to seek employment and freedom and this kind of thing. And it wasn't when sometime thereafter she wrote back to Miss Julia and said, I haven't been paid, I'm tired of whatever,
Yeah.
and can I come back? And Miss Julia said, yes, you come back, and as you said, that was where she really lived her latter days.
Right.
In that cabin.
Yes, and we found over the more research that she was coming back to visit every now and then. So yeah, this was. I think she felt like they owed her, but also it was the only place she knew.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
She was, she was part of the family.
Yeah. Yeah, and people up there were all dying on her. So.
They weren't paying her what they owed.
Right,
Well,
she
that's
hired
bad.
a lawyer,
Yeah.
and that didn't work.
That's
Yeah,
terrible.
yeah.
Anyhow,
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah.
there's probably a whole lot more. I thought we'd add in.
Yes, that's
Family was a
good.
neighbor,
Especially since I'm as old as this group is too.
Batty.
What about Uncle Silas's house? Was it over that way?
It was right on the river.
And what is there anything left, like a foundation?
No, he
thing, or-
called it a cabin. So I'm not sure that it was built real securely. His son inherited it, and he lived there for a little bit. But then he sold it and moved to Missouri. So James
was
had a
it
farm in Missouri also.
Down this way, I guess? Or?
Oh, you know where the Scots live on
Yeah.
the river near the
Yeah.
school?
Oh, down that way.
He
Right,
owned
it's
a portion of land there and a portion over here.
Yeah.
But this was the first one, so I think he probably lived there.
Uh-huh.
Well,
And he had an
you
orchard.
spoke of him having the grapes on the
island.
Grape Island.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so you'd be close to that,
would be,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, the second portion included a
Right.
bit of the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had a big orchard down there too, near Kelly Elementary. So,
And that's why he bought it.
Right,
He liked all the
right.
fruit trees,
Yeah.
not the house.
pretty nice established. And I think a lot of that orchard was still there in later years. Down,
Huh.
was it? Do you know? Down near the school, we did some research for the Noble family, the Nobles who eventually one of them was a governor of Indiana, but their some of those family members eventually had that land,
Okay.
or had it before him, I guess,
Mhm.
because that's that cemetery that's on Kelly property, and we were trying to determine where it was based on descriptions from Silas's farm, which included all these wonderful orchards that I wish were still here.
Yeah.
Then we'd be fighting off the bees.
Yay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much.